Game over?
No way!
Because we got Game Genie.
We tell you when it's over.
With Game Genie, I decide how many lives I get.
I use it when I want to live forever.
Play to the end and win. Maybe I want to start on level 15.
No problemo.
It makes cool games like Street Fighter 2 more exciting.
Less frustrating.
With Game Genie, it ain't over.
So we say it's over. Excellent!
Game Genie for NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, and Game Boy. Codes from many popular games, each sold separately.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Zach.
And I'm Seth.
And we're the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right, we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
So I'm glad that we are able to not have rough cuts hit the floor, or else people would realize that we don't even know how to start an episode after recording however many episodes that we've recorded.
It's not my fault that we have a hilarious soundboard that is only accessible to us.
That's true. You'd expect as a radio show we would have a soundboard that would be accessible to the audience.
We're not like a shock jock.
That's true. We're a shock jock. We could be.
We could be shock jocks.
We could be.
Hey everybody, welcome to Classic Gaming Brothers.
Okay, wow.
Here at WCGB.
That's the correct call sign.
Because we're East Coast, so we're W, as opposed to West Coast, which is K, until you get to the Mississippi, which is still all K, though sometimes it's W because they stopped caring.
Yeah, they stopped caring once you're in the middle of the country, whether or not you're on the East or the West Coast.
Maybe I'll actually leave that in this time, because I think I cut out you explaining that the last time that you did.
I explained that before?
Yeah.
Have we made this disc jockey joke before?
No, I don't remember why you explained it, but you went on this it was maybe 15 minutes of audio of you explaining the different call signs.
Did you know it starts from weather terminals? And then
yes,
I think before that it was like weather stations, and before that it was like I think it was weather station, then Morse code. I don't know. It's like radio, like it evolved to get to those call signs. It might have been when I was explaining that all the Canadian airports have Y's in there.
No, I don't think it was that, and I don't want to know that. I don't think this that could be another episode.
No, you could just watch CPG Gray on YouTube to figure out why that's the case.
Okay, I will.
But Zach.
Yes, Seth.
So beyond talking about call signs of radio stations that we don't have, what have you been playing recently?
Seth, recently I've been playing Horizon Forbidden West, the sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn. Both games are developed by Guerrilla Games and published by Sony. Horizon Forbidden West was released in 2022. I've been playing it on my PS5. It's a very pretty game, as it's a PS5 game, and I like it. I mean, I liked the first game a lot. I don't remember much about what happened to the first game beyond that you fight robots and you have a bow and arrow. But the sequel does a good job at reminding you everything that happens in the first game, because it has a very long opening sequence that summarizes the events of the first game for you. So you play as a character named Aloy, who is a girl who was brought up in a nomadic tribe. She has a piece of tech that she found while scavenging, and she can use that to focus on different things and scan them. And the reason she was able to find this tech is because this is not a game that's set in the past. This is a game that's set in the future. It's post-apocalyptic future where humanity has been mostly wiped out by a rogue AI called Hades, and Hades controls these giant robots that like to eat people and destroy things. And humanity is basically now mostly nomadic hunter-gatherers. I mean, some civilizations have started forming up, but very simple technology. So they have a more religious reverence to types of technology versus actually using it. And Aloy is kind of supposed to be like bridging the gap because she has a mysterious past that ties her to this story. But yeah, in the game, you are hunting for the remains of Hades after he was defeated in the first game. There are rumors that he could be still alive or around. He's an AI, so he wouldn't be alive, but still around. So you're kind of going hunting for him in the quote-unquote Forbidden West, which is a place that people don't go to that often, apparently. It's a fun game. I like it. I really like the aesthetic. I like the combat. The combat's fun. You get to use bow and arrows and other various like slingshots and stuff like that. There's a bit of a stealth focus in the game where it's kind of advised that you kill things silently, but if you don't, it leads to some hectic battles that are certainly fun. But that's Horizon Forbidden West by Guerrilla Games. I believe it actually just came out on PC as well, not too long ago, but I've been playing it on PS5. Seth, what about you? What have you been recently playing?
Recently, I've been playing a demo from the Next Fest Steam event that was going on, but it will be over by the time this episode airs. It was a game called Dispatch. It's being developed and will be published by Ad Hoc Studio. Dispatch is a superhero workplace game where you play as the dispatch service for a team of superheroes, and superheroes are to be used as a broad term talking about people who have powers versus people who are actually good with those powers. They're kind of like almost like a Suicide Squad type of deal where the people who are in your group that you can control or dispatch, as it were, are kind of all like mostly jerks. Some of them are like, this guy is doing this because he burned down a building and needs to repay his debt to society. And other people are like, this guy is a large golem and doesn't really know what's going on in life. So it has a cool interactive cutscene where you have like quick time events with some like cartoony graphics as you are essentially a superhero who could no longer be a superhero. I believe your character would go into like this like mech suit and something happened and the mech suit is gone, so now your superhero can't go into a mech suit, so he has to go work dispatch. There's a old man who works in the records department and he knows the superhero because he wasn't always an old man, but he was like a Flash character and realized whenever he ran fast, so did his body, and he just aged super fast, so then he looks like a really old Einstein man, and your character hasn't seen him in like 10 years and he's like, whoa. And there's like some quick time events that come up where you can kind of make decisions in the moment, and then it switches to like the game portion where it's similar to This Is the Police, which has you like dispatching officers to certain crime scenes. This one just has you dispatching superheroes. They work on like a map system where there's like little pop-ups that show up and you have to send the right people to it, but you don't know if it's the right person. There's usually like a little heat map to show you like where does this person's skill lie, and then you have to read the context of what they're doing and decide who that's available has the right skill set map to go to it, and then you send them, and then the event that you sent them to has a map that shows up, and if it overlays well with your superhero map, then like you'll kind of automatically win and be successful at that event. But if it doesn't, you can be unsuccessful at the event, and some bad things can happen if you are unsuccessful. There's also a lot of events that happen to the point where I felt a little anxious because there was just too much going on, and like either all my superheroes were resting or doing things, and there was like the city was burning down. Overall, the game is a fun strategy game. I think it's a unique take on the like the dispatcher type of game. For me, I don't know if I feel like I want to like those type of games, but then I end up feeling really anxious when I play them, so then it's not necessarily a good thing for me to play them. But I did like the aesthetic and I did like the premise, so maybe if you like those type of games, check out Dispatch. It's got good heart.
Nice. That's exciting. Well, today we're talking about something that's kind of a follow-up to last week's episode. Last week we talked about Micro Machines, and we talked a bit about the history of Micro Machines and the company Gloob, which developed Micro Machines. And we talked about the video games associated with them. And during that discussion, we talked about the Game Genie. Briefly, we talked about how Gloob was sued by Nintendo because of this thing called the Game Genie. And that got me thinking about cheat devices, specifically ones that were made for consoles. And I was a bit curious about the history of cheat devices. They do have a long, interesting history, and a lot of them are kind of tied together. But before we get into the actual history of things like the Game Genie and other cheat devices, Seth, do you have any memories of different cheat devices like the Game Genie?
Yeah, I do. I remember when they came out, and I believe I remember an OG Game Genie. That's some people that we knew owned it for their SNES, I believe you could have it for. Or the NES. Was there one on the NES or no? I think it was just...
Yeah, NES, NES, SNES, Sega Genesis, Game Boy.
So I remember it on the SNES for sure. And like once I was exposed to it, when I was a kid, it was kind of fun to learn that you could just make the game easier, which as somebody who I don't think I've ever been really good at games, it was cool that I could actually like win. You could give yourself infinite lives and do all that sort of things. I think with the advent of save states and difficulty levels, I think cheating has become a little more less produced by companies to help you cheat and more like adjusting either the difficulty down or hacking the game.
Yeah, I feel like when you were cheating at a game, you weren't really doing it to be
malicious?
to try to like... Yeah, to not be malicious, like you were cheating maybe to do something silly or to get through a hard part of the game or just because you wanted to just have fun. I mean, some cheats, especially some of the old Game Genie and Game Shark cheats, some of them were just aesthetic stuff.
Yeah.
Like I remember there was an N64 one for Mario 64 where it just got rid of his hat, and there was another one that just made him sink into the ground so that it was just his upper body.
And like there was I believe you could use it to unlock all the James Bond in-game cheats where then you could turn on like big head mode through the in-game cheat engine. So I think, or you could use it to just unlock certain things, which was kind of fun. But yeah, there was some silly stuff. I also think that like cheating on any sort of single player experience is fine, right? You're only making your experience what it is for you. I think when it comes to like cheating online and like getting involved in like competitions and like aim hacks and all that kind of stuff, that's no bueno. I don't think that's a good thing for people to be doing.
Yeah. I think there's kind of a fine line when it comes to cheating in video games where it's like if you are just doing it because you want to have a good time or you want to like get through a hard part of a game, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But if you're doing it to like fake a speed run or gain an upper hand at a competitive game, I think that is no good, no bueno. Don't do that. And those type of people usually get banned. Getting into my memories, I remember we actually did have the Sega version of the Game Genie. We also had a Game Shark. For the Sega version of the Game Genie, I remember it was one of those things that I would go to GameWinners.com and print out an entire printer page of Game Genie cheats to type in for different games that I definitely didn't need them for, like Sonic the Hedgehog 2. But some of them I remember were fake, and they made me very sad. There was one that was like, you put in this cheat and you'll play as like a different colored Sonic. And maybe I did it wrong, but it never worked for me. And there were others that were like, for Sonic 3, I think there was one where it was like, do this and you'll unlock Ultra Sonic. And I was like, wow, Super Sonic is cool. Hyper Sonic is cool. What is Ultra Sonic? No, that didn't do anything either. It was one of those things where the only way to know, though, was by trying it out, because there weren't any people like necessarily saying, oh, this cheat's fake on GameWinners.com. It was just a list of numbers that you had to type in to your Game Genie when you plugged it in. And for those who've never used a Game Genie, that is literally what it's like. You start up the console with the Game Genie plugged in, and you get this blue screen with like a cursor and different letters, almost like you're typing in your name in an RPG. And you have to type in, using the cursor, a multi-numbered code, a numeric code. And sometimes there are letters, but most of the time it's just numbers, and it'll be like 0000 A 06 B C A, something like that. And then you'll press start, pray that the console doesn't crash because the like connections were loose or dirty or something. Finally, you get into the game, press start on the game, and then you'll get to see if the cheat worked. Sometimes it did. The ones that were like well-known ones, like giving you all the Chaos Emeralds, for example, Sonic, or unlocking level select or something, usually worked fine, but others, you're just kind of winging it.
Yeah, and they also released code books.
They did, yeah, but we never had a code book.
Yeah.
We just had to print them out online, but there were code books available. We also had a Game Shark. I do remember not realizing that the Game Shark, you had to put in your own codes for the most part. We used the Game Shark, I think, first because we borrowed it from a friend, and it had all these codes already built in, and they were all saved to the Game Shark, and I was like, this is awesome. I get to play all these games with all these different cheats and stuff. And then I think we gave that one back to the person we borrowed it from, and then we got ourselves our own, and it had no cheats on it. So I just assumed it was broken. I also remember a friend of mine had a Game Boy Game Genie, which had this very, very tiny version of the book that came with all the codes. It was really, really small because it had to fit inside the Game Boy Game Genie itself, which had a little cupboard that you could put the book in.
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
And listener of the show, Sean, wanted a special shout out where he used to get the action replay for the Game Boy Advance, and it would break, and then he would have to buy a new one. And this happened to him multiple times.
That's funny.
But getting into the history of these cheating devices, as mentioned, when we covered Galoob last week, it just brought back this flood of memories of the Game Genie and the Game Shark. I'm fairly certain we've never done a dedicated episode on cheat devices. I think we have mentioned Game Genie and Game Shark before, but this is definitely going to be more focused on the history and how these things worked. And in terms of history, cheating in games has existed for pretty much as long as games themselves have existed. Even prior to electronic games and video games, people have always wanted the upper hand when playing a game, and some may have gone to unscrupulous methods of achieving that goal. Counting cards, peeking, playing with modified pieces, using loaded dice. It just goes on and on and on. There's always a way to cheat at a game. For video games, though, some of the earliest cheats were put in place by programmers to make playtesting easier. We talked about this in our Easter eggs episode. For example, the famous Konami code was put in because the programmers didn't want to have to play through the game over and over again because they kept getting game overs. Though another example was Manic Miner, which has a cheat mode that could be activated by typing the numbers 6031769, and that would unlock this cheat mode. Now, these numbers, 6031769, was the programmer's license number that he had at the time, and that's how he was able to remember it. So I assume he had to change that after people found out that was the code.
Before cheat devices became available, there was a type of cheating through use of trainers. Trainers were programs often designed by cracking groups that would be integrated into the game's codes, sometimes as part of a crack from a pirated copy of a game, and would allow the player to enable various cheats on startup. I knew about trainers because those would be the weird, sketchy programs that would run on my computer when I was attempting to fix a game to make it work faster or better. Or
yeah. Yeah.
That's what you would call them. You'd get like a trainer. Trainers would be commercially available as well, such as the Great Escape utility for 1981 Castle Wolfenstein. These trainers would do things like add unlimited lives, remove ammo requirements, or make your player invulnerable. I think I had a trainer for Doom, for example, though Doom had its own cheat codes integrated as well. Trainers do something different than a standard cheat code. While the Konami code was programmed into the game, a trainer would modify the game code by inserting data into the areas of the code to give you a desired outcome. Also a way to get around anything that tracked whether or not you were cheating. So like a game would know if you entered in a cheat code, it wouldn't know if you actually messed around with the code. Games have gotten a little bit smarter and they now know that if you messed around with the code, and so sometimes you have to cheat on top of cheats. Talking broadly in regards to cheats, like I'm thinking about like Fallout mods. You can mod the game and then it will disable any achievements, and then you can mod the game again to pretend that it's not modded. And that's kind of like a similar type of like trainers and cheat engines would allow you to go around and modify things. I remember I had a trainer for XCOM, Terror from the Deep. What it would allow me to do was it allow me to go in and modify values in the game. So I'd run the trainer and I'd go in and I'd select my squad person and I would modify the values so that I could make their armor really high. And you had to do all the armor values on every single body panel of the person, because then if you had armor values on everything but like their underbody, that they could get killed from like a grenade going off. And so then I used that to actually beat Terror from the Deep. And to this day, Terror from the Deep is the only XCOM game I actually have beaten even though I've loved the franchise, and I only beat it through the use of trainers. And so as games were released for various computers, hackers would dive into games code and figure out what works. Some early 8-bit computers even had commercially available cartridges that allowed you to stop a program, add in your own code, and restart a program. A lot of older computers utilize commands such as peek and poke, which would allow you to either see the byte located at a specific memory address, that would be peeking, or you could place a memory byte at a specific address, which would be poking. On the Commodore, if you used a device to stop the program, you could input a poke command at the needed byte to alter the code. And if you altered the code, you could, if you knew what you were doing, change the game. Maybe make it so instead of having 1 life, you had 100 lives by just adding a couple of digits. It wasn't secret. Everyone was relatively open with doing this. And magazines would actually feature poke commands that could be used for various games and their desired results. The way this works, for example, is if you know where the code ammo is stored, you could poke that code to set the value to something ridiculously high, or even disable the system's way of checking if there was a value there. And various magazines and trades would say, this is how you do it.
And now, this is all fun and good for people on home computers, but for consoles, you were a bit more limited. People primarily had to rely on built-in cheat codes, such as things like the Konami code or inputting a certain password in the password screen on an NES game to unlock something hidden. That wasn't until the Game Genie. The Game Genie came about in the late 80s when Codemasters saw the success of the NES and grew a desire to create games for it. Nintendo, however, refused to meet with Codemasters founder Dave Darling at CES. I think the story was that I read that Dave Darling went up to Nintendo and said, hey, I would like to meet with you guys so that we can finalize a plan so that we can put out games for your system. And Nintendo said, you have to set up an official meeting with us. We will not discuss this at CES. And Dave Darling said, that means no. So he, instead of setting up an official meeting with Nintendo, his team reverse engineered the NES. And they started work on creating games for the NES. Obviously, they put out Micro Machines for the NES, but one of their first projects that they did was porting Treasure Island Dizzy, one of their own IPs, to the NES. And while they were porting it, they had developed a prototype cartridge that had a knob on it that you could use to adjust the number of lives in the game. Codemasters thought this was kind of novel, this idea that you could modify game code essentially on the fly. So if you could do that for one game, why not all games? And so they built a cartridge that was able to essentially piggyback on another NES cartridge. When you turned it on, a player would be able to input codes and start the game with those codes activated. Now what's interesting is that when you use a Game Genie, you are not typing in pre-programmed cheat codes. You are literally altering the ROM data. The codes you type are in integer values that are replacing data that is on the ROM chip in the cartridge. Now this isn't a permanent thing because obviously the ROM card data is going through the Game Genie into the NES. You're literally stopping the data before it reaches the NES and altering it there. But it's really a novel idea, right? As the data is being passed through the Game Genie, you modify it and your desired outcome is what you play. And it's also not a permanent change. All you had to do was unplug the game from the Game Genie, it's back to normal. When the Game Genie released in 1990, it came bundled with a book of codes for various games that were already available on the market. But there's one problem with that. Quickly became outdated because by the time the book was on the shelf, there were already games not in the book.
Right.
And also, Codemasters and Galoob were finding new codes. And they kept finding new codes for these games. And they didn't want to just keep these codes hidden or secret. So what they did was Galoob, the publisher of the Game Genie, would create a paid service where you could subscribe to receive updated code booklets on a monthly basis.
That's a great one of those subscription boxes.
Yeah, exactly. And hey, it's actually kind of useful, unlike other subscription boxes. Now, the other cool thing about the Game Genie is that if you don't have a code book for some reason, it's not completely useless. You could actually try to create your own codes. It takes some troubleshooting, but what you're essentially doing is peeking and poking, right? So you're typing in random data, maybe taking a note of the random data you typed, pressing start, seeing what happens, making a note of that, and going from there. And as you get closer and closer to your desired result, you can kind of fine-tune the code. Maybe you find that a certain first 4 numbers work in a certain way so that you know that the last 4 do a certain thing. Maybe you find that the first 4 maybe address the lives function, so you can modify the lives there. So that's kind of the way it works. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to get people into programming in a way that I think is kind of novel. But also, if you do pick up a Game Genie and you don't have a book for it, you're not at a total loss.
Nintendo was, of course, not super pleased. In 1992, they would file a lawsuit against Galoob. We talked about this in our Micro Machines episode. Sales would stop in the US briefly, but continue in Canada. Reportedly, Galoob ran ads in Canadian game magazines that said, "Thank you, Canada." The court would side with Galoob in the US market and rule that Galoob did not infringe on Nintendo's copyright. With this legal victory in hand, Galoob would negotiate with Sega and secure official approval for the Game Genie to be released on the Sega Genesis, saying, "Hey Sega, we're going to do this, and we have legal precedent that we can, so why don't you partner with us instead of fighting us?" And they, of course, with that legal precedent, they would go on to release an SNES version, a Game Boy version, and a Game Gear version would all follow. The lawsuit also helped open the door for other type of cheat devices. For example, Daedal brought their Action Replay, which we mentioned earlier in this episode, that they originally released for 8-bit computers, IBM PC and Amiga, over to the NES and later the SNES. Galoob would file a patent for the Game Genie in order to potentially prevent Daedal from taking any of their sales, but Daedal will fight back by saying, "We did it first on the PC. Like, you are just copying us." And one area that the Action Replay improved over the Game Genie was a built-in trainer, which made it easier to hunt for codes. So it essentially the Action Replay built-in trainer would, I feel like it would brute force codes until it found one that actually worked, and then once it identified one that actually worked, it would save it and say like, "Yep, this works." And it could, in fact, break your game that you were doing. Galoob would drop from development the Game Genie after they were acquired by Hasbro in 1997. Hasbro was like, let's not do this anymore. However, Daedal would go on to become the main cheat device developer as games went into the realm of CDs. When the PlayStation was released, the Action Replay released for it would utilize a data port on the back of the PS1. You would connect the device up to a PC serial port, and you could search a code database using a custom ISA card. A later version called Pro Action Replay would allow for code lookup without the need for connecting it to a PC. In the US, the Action Replay for the PS1 was renamed to the Game Shark and was published by Interact. There were later releases in the US under Action Replay branding for different consoles. Per a forum post on PSX Dev, getting an Action Replay set up for PS1 was a bit of a process. You needed to set the jumper correction on the communication card, set up your PS1 to the TV, make sure it's close to your Windows 98 compatible PC, plug in the proprietary board to an available ISA slot, plug the Action Replay into your PS1, connected via a parallel cable to the PC, and there you go. Now you're all set to go. Actually, learning how to play the game was probably almost more inconvenient.
It's almost not worth it.
You were probably sold on a promise that the marketers lied to you about. Sony would go on to remove the port on the back of the PS1, so Daedal would go on to create a disc version of the Action Replay / Game Shark, because they said, "Sony, you may take this away from us, but we'll figure out another way."
Oh man, the disc version of also Action Replay is janky. Basically, the way it worked was through hot swapping. So you had to put the Action Replay in. You had to set it to like the certain game that you wanted it to be working for, and you put in whatever codes you want. And then while the system was on, you had to open it, take the CD out, put your other CD in, close it, and it would boot into the right code set. It was a way, though, for people, they later found out, using an Action Replay on some devices, such as I believe the PS1, allowed you to play import games because the Action Replay bypassed the region lock, and once that was out of the way, you can just get right into the game. So that kind of opened the door for importing games for a while. Now, in 1997, Daedal released a Game Shark for the N64. Like the Game Genie, you would lock on a cartridge and you could input codes, but the codes would also be able to save to flash memory. This could also bypass region lockout, so you could play any N64 game on your unit. So if you wanted to play a Japanese game on your American unit, you could. And for the most part, Japanese N64 games this should work fine on a non-Japanese unit, like on an American unit. It is a physical lockout, if my memory serves, but you don't need to modify like physical pieces. You don't need to like cut away at the cartridge or anything to get it to fit. You can just pop it onto the Game Shark. In 2003, the company Mad Catz, spelled with a Z, which is famous for possibly the worst third-party controllers that are out there, would acquire the Game Shark license and distribute Game Shark discs for later Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo consoles. Now, just an interesting part of the N64's Game Shark history is that there was an online kit called SharkWire Online, developed by Interact, which was branded with the Game Shark license, and this would allow you to connect a keyboard and a modem to use a Mosaic web browser on your N64. However, because it was unauthorized, you had to get around the lockout chip, and to do this, you had to take an authorized N64 cartridge and stick it into the modem, which it looks ugly, but it at least allowed you to go on the internet on your N64. I don't know why you would want to.
Search for codes?
Not even just that. It had access to Fox Sports and like Capcom's website. In fact, Pro, EB Games, Eidos, Capcom, Fox Sports, they all had official partnerships with Interact to allow you to access various services that they provided via this limited web browser functionality. Now, Action Replay would continue producing their own line of cheat discs for Xbox, GameCube, PS2, and the Wii. And the last traditional Action Replay device released on the DSi, though they would put out a thing on the 3DS called Power Saves and Power Saves Pro in 2013, though from everything I can read, it doesn't work like an Action Replay traditionally worked. In fact, it was just prepackaged with codes. Outside of the Game Genie and Action Replay, there were countless other code devices. Code Break by Pelican Accessories was another big one. There was the Exploder, Xploder Exploder, developed by Blaze. And apparently the Exploder has an official PS4 version that was available to purchase as of 2018. In terms of legacy, there really aren't any of the same kind of cheat devices available. Trainers still exist. You can still get trainers for various games. However, they're probably going to get you VAC banned if like it's even detected that you have a trainer running or an outside program running that is interacting with your game that you're running through a system like Steam. It's very probable that you're going to get in trouble if it's detected. Though reportedly, there is a company that announced as of last year that it is bringing back the Game Shark as an AI-powered hint tool.
Oh, that's like Game Shark being like, Clippy's here.
No, that'd be like if Windows was like, hey, Clippy's back. He's an AI chatbot. I think that basically sums up cheat devices. There were some really interesting ones. For example, there was one that I learned about called the GB Hunter for the PS1, and this was also, not only did this have a cheat device built in, it was a Game Boy player for your PlayStation 1, so you could play Game Boy games on your PlayStation 1. Not very well, but it did have some cheat devices built in. And there's just kind of a countless number of strange different cheat devices that were available, similar in vein to the Game Genie and the Action Replay. I do remember knowing more about Game Genie when I was little and less about Action Replay. I think by the time that I was getting like my GameCube and stuff, I just wasn't really that invested in the cheat scene, and I never picked up an Action Replay for my GameCube or any of my Game Boy Advances or anything like that. But I do remember hearing about Action Replay, and mostly because I remember going on GameWinners.com and there would have the option for either Game Genie cheats or Action Replay cheats. And I always like, man, I miss out on a whole different world by just playing with a Game Genie.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think that will do it for the most part for our cheat devices episode. But before we wrap everything completely up, we'll get into our retro rewinds. Seth had me play Zombie Nation for NES, developed by Kaz, K-A-Z-E, or Kaze, and released in 1990 in Japan and 1991 in the US. Zombie Nation is an amazing game. It's kind of like a side-scrolling shooter, except instead of playing as a ship, you play as a giant floating samurai head. And instead of shooting other ships, you just shoot shoot everything. Buildings, people, snipers, different like creatures and stuff. Everything's out to get you. You're just going on a rampage, essentially. However, you do this with good intentions, because according to the story, aliens have landed, and it is your job to stop them, because they are bad. They crashed in a meteorite, and now they are attacking the city. And for some reason, a giant floating samurai head is the only one that can save the day. In the Japanese version of the game, it's basically the same story, except you play as a giant Tengu mask, which is a creature from Japanese folklore, so it wouldn't have been easily translatable to the American audience. Why they chose giant samurai head, not sure. It's a pretty chaotic game, with sometimes sprites just completely disappearing because there's so much happening on the screen. The NES can't handle it, but it doesn't really take away from its absurdity or its fun. I think it's a silly game, and I like it a lot. I definitely think it holds up in a weird sort of way, especially if you like really weird games that are just over the top and you don't have to take them seriously. Next week, Seth, you can play Snake's Revenge for the NES.
Great. And what I think is fun is that I had you play Zombie Nation for the NES, and it was released first in Japan and then in the US, and you had me play Jetsons Invasions of Planet Pirates for the SNES, which was released first in North America and then was so good it was then reskinned and released in Japan. So in 1994, developed by Sting and published by Taito, in North America, Zach had me play the Jetsons game, and it would go on to get reskinned and published by Kato Kawawa Shoten and released under the name Yokai Buster Ruka no Daiboken. The Jetson game, you play as George Jetson, and you have a vacuum cleaner that allows you to suck up enemies and to grip walls. It's a fun mascot platformer, very much like Looney Tunes, except if the Looney Tunes creature used a suggestive vacuum at a length that looks like it's close to other things down in the middle of George's body. In the reskin version, you play as Ruka, who wants to get rid of demons, and instead of a vacuum, you have a little red alien demon head that you squeeze, and he does the sucking. And it's probably some manner of yokai, since the game is called Yokai Buster. Both of the games are challenging, but both of the games have really tight controls. The levels are fun, and the sucking mechanic, albeit a bit weird, is unique. It's unique for those games of that time. So I think the game holds up. The games are fun. The levels are fun. Only issue is no saves and no passwords. So good luck. Because if you die enough times, you're done. But I think overall the game holds up. Next week, Zach, you can play Truxton for the Mega Drive.
Great, I will. Well, thank you everyone for listening to today's episode. If you have any memories of using cheat devices on your NES, your Super Nintendo, or what have you, let us know. And you can do so by emailing us at classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. We're available wherever podcasts can be found, be it Podbean, iTunes, or iHeartRadio. We're also available on social media, Classic Gaming Brothers or CG Brothers Pod. Look us up. If you can't find us as one, look us up as the other. We're available on Twitch, Classic Gaming Brothers, and of course we're available on our website, www.classicgamingbrothers.com. Seth, am I forgetting anything?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Seth.
And I've been Zach.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
Right.